Maybe not to be so high. This one in the middle, it's all of a sudden right here, Kate.
Yeah.
Oh. No, I don't think so. Definitely not. If it could go down, it's like right high. Let's just see what happens. Maybe. Who's this thing? Who's blue water bottle?
There.
Thank you. Okay, great. All right, we are going to call our meeting to order.
Where is it?
Okay, we're live and we're going to call our meeting to order. Welcome to the Vermont Legislature's House Committee on Environment and Energy. This afternoon, we're going to be ultimately taking up S5, but we have with us first Representative Sibilia to talk a little bit about the background history of this idea.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I appreciate having a few moments to just help our new committee kind of come through the transition with us that has gotten us here today. There are a number of transitions. I want to share mine, a number of things that have happened. I want to share the process that has happened for me. I think it might have been in 2017, we had a 2-cent gas tax proposed here in the House. And I remember asking our chair at that time, what are we going to do with that money? And how do we know that what we're going to do is enough? How do we know how much more we will need? What is already happening? How can we quantify this? What's the plan? And there was not a good answer for that. And so that was really hard for me to support, and I did not. But our committee picked up a piece of legislation that had been brought to us by very active climate caucus here in the legislature, bicameral, that had been out talking with hundreds of Vermonters. And that was the Global Warming Solutions Act, a piece of legislation that had been put forward in other states. And we sought to take that up and create a plan for how we can help Vermonters adapt to climate change, how we will know how much money we need to help Vermonters adapt, and to put in place systems for adaptation. And that bill was hard. We worked through it. We worked with hundreds of people again, including the administration, and passed that bill. And that resulted in an incredible climate council acting really quickly to bring forward a plan for us, the climate action plan. And we will hear more about the climate action plan and progress on that as part of our testimony on S5. There are aspects of that plan for helping us help Vermonters adapt to climate change, help us reduce our emissions. Specifically, we need to be reducing emissions in the thermal and heating sectors. And so one proposal that came out of the Global Warming Solutions Act was something called the Clean Heat Standard. And so that bill was brought forward last year. So that's kind of brought us to where we are. It was brought forward. A lot of work was done on that, again, with our Climate Council, again, with hundreds of Vermonters, and did not quite make it last year. But a lot of work went into that. And here we are this year with an improved bill. Again, folks continuing to engage and work on this policy. So I want to acknowledge the hundreds of people who have helped refine and define this piece of legislation for our consideration and possible improvement. The governor and his staff, past and present legislative colleagues and leaders of the House and Senate, advocates for the fuel dealers, a just energy transition, low and moderate income Vermonters, renewable energy and efficiency, farmers, loggers, local governments, businesses, and literally hundreds of Vermonters over the past few years who have engaged with us, our climate caucus, our town leaders, and our fuel dealers. There is a lot of attention on this bill. And there's a lot at stake. That's why there's so much attention on this bill. Climate change is already affecting our communities, our businesses, and future. In addition, there's a major industry sector in our country and globally that itself is in a transition. Fossil fuels, our energy. And so that creates a lot of tension and a lot of attention for us. There are hundreds of reasons that this work deserves our attention and support. But I want to focus on three for me, and I want to share those with you. First of all, I think we need to center in our work the rural and poor Vermonters, especially regular Vermonters. That is who this work has to be done for. We have seen other systems in transition recently. We've done a lot of work in the legislature on, for instance, our telephone system. So our telecommunications, we had a legacy system, telephone lines, and we had innovation and cellular internet access, et cetera. As those systems, internet and cell, were evolving and improving, and folks with the means to access those were having their lives improved and able to have more efficiency and better ease in their lives. Those who did not have access to that transition were left with our legacy phone lines. And that legacy phone line was harder and harder to maintain and harder for Vermonters to count on. Okay. And that started to create a situation of public safety. When I think about our fossil fuel transition, I can see similarities in terms of what could be happening here with our rural and poor Vermonters in particular. The energy transition away from fossil fuels is in motion, and our neighbors who have the means to reduce their fossil fuel use are doing so. Our fossil fuel dealers who have the ability to transition their business into new markets are doing it. And we'll hear about that. It is the smallest, the poorest, and the most rural who are already being left behind in an environment that is becoming more and more volatile, both weather-wise and financially. A second reason, the rate of transition is picking up, and hopefully it will continue to escalate. A leading journal on global financing trends says in this month's issue that 2022 was a record year for energy transition investments, with a reported 1.3 trillion invested globally. These increased investment levels are being driven by strong government policy toward low carbon investment and supported by an intense effort on the part of governments around the world to create the regulatory regimes and incentives for low carbon technologies to attract attention. This transition is going to continue to accelerate. Yesterday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with yet another warning. Their latest assessment that humanity still has a chance, close to the last, to prevent the worst of climate change's future harms. But doing so requires quickly slashing nearly 2/3 of carbon pollution by 2035. What does this mean? As this transition is accelerating, as the sense of urgency is increasing, no one is going to be standing still. And the risk to vulnerable Vermonters is rising. We already see that climate has changed. We already see the weather has changed, and that changing weather is increasing risk to vulnerable Vermonters. Reducing our emissions to zero will not stop this. Developing countries and the actions of larger states and countries, however, will impact Vermonters. And so doing nothing, trying to maintain the status quo is a losing proposition for rural, poor Vermonters and small businesses who we must keep in the focus of our effort here. We see the volatility in globally priced fuel markets, and we know Vermonters paid nearly $2 more per gallon for heating oil this winter than they did in 2021. Vermonters with the means to reduce their fossil fuel usage and fuel bills to protect their families and businesses are doing it. We need to help those who don't have those means. As we move through this, we need to keep fixed, low, and moderate income Vermonters centered in our discussions. They cannot get out of the way. And we also need to keep small fuel dealers in focus too. We need them. They provide critical services for heat and maintaining heat in Vermonters' homes. And they're really stressed about this transition. They are really stressed, and we still have to try and help them. So, Madam Chair, thank you again for giving me a few moments to talk about why I think this is incredibly important. I hope that we will ask really good questions for Vermonters. They're counting on us. Make sure we understand the significant amount of work that has gone into this and improve and then move this policy. Thank you.
Members have questions for Representative Sibilia. Representative Smith.
Thank you. You mentioned, thank you, Laura. You mentioned, Representative, you mentioned this program is going to be really good for regular Vermonters as opposed to what other kind of Vermonters?
What's that?
You mentioned regular Vermonters.
Yes.
Who lives in Vermont that's not a regular Vermonter?
I guess all Vermonters are regular Vermonters.
Okay, good enough. Or now.
Thanks, Laura. Okay, Representative.
Thank you.
Right. I think. Mr. Duvall, did you want to go next? And is that?
Yeah,
You need to go?
I have a.
You have a time. Okay, great. Right. Secretary Moore, please join us.
And good afternoon. It is a pleasure to be here. If you give me 1 second, I will share my screen so you can all be on the same page. So for the record, I'm Julie Moore. I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources, and I'm joined today by Colin Smythe, who's part of our Climate Action Office. And we're going to provide a brief overview of the greenhouse gas inventory that the agency is responsible for maintaining. And then Colin, talk a little bit about the connection between the inventory and some of the requirements of S5. And then Colin's going to give you a preview of the soon to be released report that will cover through 2020. So the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is required by statute, and it's been used to establish what our 1990 and 2005 baseline greenhouse gas emissions levels are. It's focused on gross greenhouse gas emissions, meaning it doesn't take into account sequestration, no sinks or CO2 removals, just emissions. And it breaks those emissions estimates down by sector. Representative Sibilia talking about the clean heat standard is talking about what we sometimes refer to as the RCI sector, the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use. That's the second most significant source of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont to transportation. And then we have a number of other sectors. We really endeavor to do our work in a way that's consistent regionally, nationally, and frankly, internationally to allow for comparison across jurisdictions. In addition, the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is used to determine progress towards the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And 10 VSA Section 578 notes specifically that we are going to track greenhouse gas emissions from within Vermont, measured and inventoried pursuant to Section 582, which is the section that directs us to prepare the greenhouse gas emissions inventory annually. So the approach we are using in building this greenhouse gas emissions inventory is consistent with standards and protocols used by other entities, including the IPCC, the same organization Representative Sibilia spoke to, whose report was released earlier this week, as well as EPA, that has created several tools that are in wide use by states across the country to assist in quantifying the greenhouse gas emissions associated with different sectors. And this is important because, as I noted before, it does enable regional collaboration with neighboring states, and it allows us to be able to understand and track our own efforts in comparison to what's taking place in other parts of the country as well as parts of the world. In addition, breaking it down by sectors is important because it allows us to understand which activities may be disproportionately contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore ripe for mitigation. So the way we prepare the greenhouse gas emissions inventory is to use available activity data, so fuel volumes, most notably emissions factors, federal data sets and EPA tools, as well as a set of assumptions that allow us to estimate greenhouse gas emissions. It's important to note that when we're preparing our inventory, the number of those key data sets can actually lag by a period of a couple of years. And some of that is it's being aggregated at a regional or national level and then disaggregated back to Vermont. And so we're behind. And the data Colin will share with you in a few minutes here reflects through the end of calendar year 2020. The emissions estimates that are included on our inventory are all normalized to CO2 equivalents. So it accounts for things like methane, NOx, and HFCs and PFCs, but they're all converted effectively to carbon dioxide equivalents. And it does not include biogenic CO2, so biomass and wood burning. And this is also consistent with the IPCC guidelines for how to calculate a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. We anticipate releasing our updated report in April, and we're going to separate the inventory from a methodology document. And part of that is in response to the Global Warming Solutions Act, because the legal cause of action under the Global Warming Solutions Act is tied specifically to this greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And so we felt it was important to have a sort of standalone methodology that will be a more static document and updated, clearly updated when changes in the methodology are made, as opposed to the inventory that will be released on this annual basis. And Colin can speak to this in more detail, but we recently, when we released the 2019 inventory, had to make a fairly significant change in how we were modeling transportation data due to some errors and inconsistencies we found in the model we had relied on previously. So that sort of change in process would be documented in the methodology report, the results presented in the inventory. In terms of the nexus between the greenhouse gas emissions inventory and the clean heat standard, there are some challenges here, and I've attempted to lay them out at hopefully a high and understandable level. Clean heat standard, or S5 as drafted, would require the PUC to establish the number of clean heat credits that need to be retired each year based on the obligated parties' contribution to them the previous year. This is going to be a challenge given the lag in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory reporting, which we're saying is about 24 months. We think there's some opportunities to improve that. And in fact, staff in the climate office have been working with the tax department and DMV to look at improving fuel data reporting in the state of Vermont that could help us augment some of the other data sets we currently rely on, but just flagging that as an issue. Also, fuel sales, as you might expect, are noisy and really weather dependent. This year, I suspect our thermal consumption is down significantly as compared to last year, not by necessarily virtue of any change in how folks are heating their homes, but by virtue of the fact that this has been a relatively mild winter. And so it's unclear to me whether relying on a single previous year is actually practical and establishing targets, or we would just be amplifying the noise that already exists in that system. Another area I think deserves further discussion is that the greenhouse gas inventory estimates the gross emissions by sector. And this is different than what is required in S5, which is directed based on life cycle emissions. And so it is not immediately clear to me how we would establish and harmonize those two different types of ways for evaluating greenhouse gas emissions. And then, we also would have the challenge of, if we move the greenhouse gas inventory in the direction of the life cycle analyses that are indicated by S5 currently, we would then find ourselves inconsistent with the approach recommended by the IPCC and EPA, and lose some of our ability to do those compare and contrast with regional, national, and global partners. Just to say a few words about life cycle assessment, this is absolutely been an area of interest for the Climate Council and also our climate office. A life cycle assessment, for those not familiar, seeks to look at not just the emissions associated with the direct burning of a product, but also the entire life cycle to produce the product. So from extraction to combustion or disposal. It isn't the same framework we're using in the greenhouse gas inventory, but we do believe it's helpful additional information in that it provides a more holistic view and important information that can be brought to bear in considering energy choices and alternatives. We do currently have a contract in place to conduct life cycle and assessments for all existing and emerging energy sources that are being used in Vermont. And this is to look at greenhouse gas emissions look at greenhouse gas emissions and aggregate them based on energy usage totals. But our plan currently is to not include that work directly in the greenhouse gas inventory to maintain its comparability with our neighboring jurisdictions. And we're on track to see that work completed this summer. I think with that, I can pause there, but turn it over to Colin to give you sort of a preview of what we're seeing in the 2020 report. I don't know how you'd like to handle that. If you want Colin to walk through his pieces, and then we're both available to answer questions.
Well, I want to see if folks have questions for you specifically on what was just presented. I have a question on your slide 5, and I think just understanding the inventory better would help. And maybe Colin will get into that, but seems like there's the different categories seem potentially to overlap, particularly the top of them, fossil fuel industry, a little red dot, but it's going to be fueling a lot of those other uses, right? So,
well, the fossil fuel industry is essentially, I think, leaks from like the natural gas system. In other places, it might be wells or other sources that emit in and of themselves. But I think in Vermont, and Colin can correct me if I'm wrong, it would be leaks from like BGS's distributions.
Thanks.
Fugitive emissions, I think, is the term. Is that right?
Yeah. Okay. Does anyone else have questions for Secretary Moore? Not yet. Representative Morris.
Well, thank you, madam. Thank you, Madam Secretary, for coming in.
Yes.
Regarding that, the graph right there that you have on slide 4, is that not somewhat dependent on temperature? You mentioned, so wouldn't the temperature also should be added to this graph so we get an idea of what the trend is?
So that's an interesting question. I think it would probably have the greatest impact on that medium blue bar, the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use, as opposed to perhaps transportation, where it's less weather dependent and probably tracks more closely to the price per gallon of gas, in addition to some other factors. But I don't know if we've done work sort of looking at RCI fuel use in light of weather patterns over time?
I've looked at it with heating degree days. So yes, I haven't graphed it or don't have it in there, but it does track pretty well with heating degree days.
If you wouldn't mind just You're about to come and join us, but
I'm
for the
sorry.
record.
Sorry, yes, Colin Smythe from Agency of Natural Resources, Climate Action Office.
Thank you. Okay. Question, Christie. Representative Stebbins.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Good afternoon, Secretary. Your comment about data and A&R working with DMV and Department of Tax, I'd understood there might be some efforts to, like, there might be some legislative clarification needed that could be occurring in the Senate, or do you know where that is at in terms of a status update?
So my understanding from the work we've done with the tax department is largely they think the changes are allowed under their existing authorities. There's a fuel data reporting form where they're reporting the sales of heating thermal fuels, I guess I should say. Some of it goes beyond heating, thermal fuels. And currently they just collect 2 cents per gallon without making any distinction about fuel type. They are looking to make changes to their form that would collect that data. So they break apart fuel oil from propane, from kerosene, et cetera. There's some confidentiality concerns. I know that there's language in S5 that sought to address them. I think the tax department felt it went further than they were comfortable with. And to be frank, I'm not sure what became of that as it left the Senate, but that's an area that needs, I think, additional attention, and would encourage you to hear from Commissioner Bolio about what his specific concerns were around confidentiality of tax data.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I have a bill on the wall to try to address that. And I believe that House Ways and Means has been able to figure out ways to address tax department's concerns about confidentiality, but perhaps we'll add that to the list.
Right, thank you.
Sure. So I will flip forward, and if you want to just use the computer, that way it's already in the. Thank you.
I have another question before we move off the slide.
Okay.
And thanks, Secretary Moore, actually, you brought it up or made me think of it. When we talk about the transportation sector, I'm wondering how that relates to price per gallon. As I think where I'm going with this, it's hard for me to grasp if we're seeing a trend on the decline in use, or if we're seeing a decline in or an increase of price, or a warmer climate that's having an impact on.
I think Colin can probably speak to some of that, but this graph up behind him right now is the transportation sector. And I think one of the things to note is the really significant decline in 2020, which we believe is in part a reflection of COVID and stay home, stay safe orders. So there are a lot of factors that go into kind of changing demand over time, but certainly cost of transportation fuels is an important.
Welcome.
For sure. Thank you. Introduce myself again. I'm Colin Smythe, Agency of Natural Resources from the Climate Action Office. And I'm going to walk through, a few kind of very high level slides on the different sectors. And if you have questions and we have time, I'm happy to dive in as much as you'd like. But as Secretary Moore mentioned, I'll just elaborate. There's certainly a lot of different factors that impact all of these sectors. Fuel prices for sure, temperatures for the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use sector, just the overall economy. And it's really hard to kind of unpack it and make a direct correlation to anything. And you can kind of do general correlations, but it's hard to pick one thing always. Sometimes it's possible, like Secretary Moore mentioned with COVID, that's a pretty slam dunk. We know why that happened. But a lot of them aren't that straightforward. I'll jump into transportation first. As Secretary Moore mentioned, a lot of these sectors are completed with EPA tools, or it's called the EPA State Inventory Tool, which is the SIT tool, as we call it. And they have separate modules kind of for all these different sectors. And to get at the overlap question, they're pretty careful about kind of, especially in that tool, and the guidance makes it pretty clear, like if you're using this framework, this is kind of what you need to count in each sector so you don't have overlap. So it is definitely a conscious thing to not do that kind of double counting. So for the transportation sector, it covers on-road emissions, kind of cars and trucks, gasoline and diesel, and a few alternative fuels. Covers non-road emissions. Some of those are also covered in the industrial processes sector, but I won't go into the details of that now. Covers aviation, gasoline, and jet fuel. And it uses several different data sets, but most notably the Joint Fiscal Office data for gasoline fuel sales. And so that's translated into gallons of gasoline by JFO. And so that is kind of plugged into the tool. And so in this particular framework, and Secretary Moore mentioned that we kind of transitioned recently, you can't really break out on-road versus non-road very well. They're both included, but it's total gasoline sales. And so there's no real breakout in that data set. So yeah, then two of the SIT modules are used for that. One to do the carbon dioxide component and one to do methane and nitrous oxide component, which is much, much smaller. All right, would you like me to move through these and have questions all at the end or after each slide?
Sure.
So the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use sector, the RCI sector, you call it, also relies on actually the same SIT module mainly. And we supplement that with kind of wood data from Forest Parks and Recreation on kind of the amount of wood combusted for the residential sector and from the Air Quality and Climate Division's kind of registration program for the commercial and industrial sectors for wood use. That only includes the nitrous oxide and methane components because the carbon dioxide is biogenic, and we can certainly talk more about that. But this mainly relies, the bulk of the sector relies on a large federal data set, which is why kind of the reporting programs that would provide better data in the kind of thermal and building sector would be great for the inventory because it would help to enable a more timely estimate in that sector. The large federal data sets are the ones that tend to lag more. It wouldn't solve the problem for all the sectors, but it would certainly help for this one. And as Secretary Moore mentioned, this sector is mostly heating buildings, cooking, and heating water is kind of what's mainly captured in this. And as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of certain end uses for kind of industrial diesel use, really. Electricity is, yes, right up front, it is the only sector in the inventory that kind of accounts for emissions that are generated outside of the borders of Vermont. And we made that decision because Vermonters use a lot more electricity, and we didn't make it recently, we made it a long time ago, but Vermonters use a lot more electricity than we generate in Vermont. And so we felt that it was kind of a more accurate representation of the emissions that we're kind of accountable for. Essentially what we do is we take data from the Public Service Department that has been adjusted for renewable energy certificate kind of retirements. And they have that by the type of generation. And so we apply kind of emission factors that we obtain from a different source from ISO New England, it's called, to those different generation types to come up with our total. Yeah, there's more detail that goes into that, but I think in the interest of time and complexity, I'll probably move on and happy to answer questions.
Well, I actually was going to amend my thinking on the questions.
Sure.
It's fine with me if members want to ask questions as we move along, and Representative Sedalia, go ahead.
I just wanted to note pretty significant reduction in emissions inventory there. And can you tell us what that correlates with?
from 2017 to 2018. I believe, and I would have to look to be absolutely sure, but I believe that was, and Jared, you might be able to help me out on this. I believe it was the signing of a nuclear contract by Green Mountain Power that really drove that reduction. There's a lot of Hydro-Quebec and hydroelectricity in the mix too, which, and the levels kind of change year to year, but I think that decline was mainly due to that nuclear.
And I think that was a part of the renewable energy standard that we passed that required us to reduce fossil fuel use and greenhouse gas emissions in our electric sector.
Sorry, yes, you're absolutely right. And that is kind of that's certainly driving the trend. And then all the commitments by all the utilities as well on top of that. And I think, I don't know about in 2020, but in some years they've surpassed those surpassed those targets in the renewable energy standard. So, but yes, you're absolutely right. It's driving.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah. Other questions? Not seeing any.
The agricultural module. So this is a module that is essentially just uses kind of US Department of Agricultural default data. And that's mainly based on like animal census values to come up with that total. See there kind of the main drivers of this sector are the enteric fermentation, manure management, and then there's some agricultural soils emissions and a small amount of liming and urea fertilization. But enteric fermentation and the manure management are kind of the big pieces there. And as you'll also see on the slide, carbon dioxide from the agricultural sector is pretty much non-existent because it's all considered biogenic. And so is not in the inventory totals. So it's almost exclusively methane and nitrous oxide. And I guess I will note on this as well that we're about to kind of get into a contract process to have a contractor review, I think it's 7 or 8 different agricultural tools to kind of make our emissions estimates more robust in this sector and to kind of incorporate more management practices on farms, as well as kind of more local data and explore what data exists. So we're looking forward to kind of making this a more Vermont-centric data set estimate in future inventories. But we don't know what's going to come of that investigation yet, but that is about to start.
Representative Smith.
Thank you. I guess farms pretty much have a buy when it comes to something like this, but when you consider cropping in the fall and planting in the spring, they take a lot of big equipment that probably creates a lot of emissions for planting. I don't think they're going to have any electric tractors in the soon to be future, but do you take all of that into consideration for emissions?
Yes, it's not included in the agricultural sector, which is kind of a little bit of a weird disconnect, but it is captured in, I believe it would be the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use. So it's captured in the fuel volumes that aren't easy to kind of disaggregate into just farm use. There are some data sets that will try to do that, but I think they're rough estimates at best. So yes, indirectly, but not attributed to this sector.
Have many thoughts gone into what can be accomplished as far as reducing those emissions that aren't included?
In terms of putting them in the agricultural sector itself, or just kind of breaking them out so we know exactly what we can attribute to them, or?
I'll leave that for now. I'm not sure how I want to ask that.
Pat had his hand up. You're talking about this. Representative
Yeah.
Sibili, Representative Pat, did you want to address this question or do you have a different question?
I have a different question.
Okay, Representative Sibilia.
Yeah, just clarifying that I believe what this slide is showing us are the greenhouse gas emissions inventory for manure and soils and different fertilizers.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I think you were asking about the equipment and where those are
Exactly.
captured. Okay,
Right.
right. And so that's not captured here.
They would be in fuel sales or other.
It would be in a different sector.
Representative Pat.
Yeah, you mentioned this earlier, but also here, I understand you're using the EPA model, but can you say a little bit more about the reason for how biogenic emissions are treated or not?
Sure. Yes, it's a little bit of a convoluted answer there, but the rationale is that the biogenic emissions, so agriculture is a little bit of a tough one, but can I use like wood burning as an example?
Okay.
Is that so? The idea is that emissions from wood burning, and this would apply to agriculture as well, they would be captured in kind of the land use change from that wood being harvested. And so if you looked at the land use sector, and it gets a little bit sticky, and I'll get to this kind of in the last slide, but in the land use sector, what it's supposed to do is it is supposed to come up with what are called fluxes, which would be if I have so much carbon in 2019, then I would have another estimate of how much carbon I have in the forest in 2020. And I'd essentially subtract those two. And I would say, okay, well, I have more carbon in the forest in 2020 than I did in 2019. And so that would be due to kind of the sequestration, carbon dioxide coming in from the atmosphere. But what it also would account for would be the trees that were cut down and taken out of the forest. And so it's kind of a positive and negative carbon flow within the system. And it's not straightforward at all. and that's kind of that's where the real problem lies in coming up with a net value, kind of counting the sequestration. Is the data is not great for determining things like that. As you can imagine, doing that for all the forests in the state of Vermont and all the forest soils is a tough question. And there are certainly models that try to do that, but I think there's a lot of work being done on it, but my personal opinion, I wouldn't say those estimates are fantastic at this point, because there are so many factors and ecosystems are very complicated.
No, I mean, that's, to me, it seems to me that there's some very big missing pieces in what I was asking about, because what it's not counting is it's counting how many trees get cut down. It's not counting if those trees weren't cut down in a sustainable forestry practices, that all of the trees would get cut down by subdivision. So it's impossible. I mean, you can go on and on like that, but in terms of life cycle, I think I tend to think a little bit further out on some of these issues.
Yeah, I totally understand that, and there are different ways to look at this too, and it depends on the time scale you're looking at, and it's not a straightforward calculation. People are trying to do it, and we're trying to kind of learn about the best practices and kind of, well, I think I would say that's true for all the states in the region. Nobody has a good handle on this. But everybody's kind of trying to get better data sets, and they're getting better satellite data, and coming up with different quantification methodologies, and there's a lot of movement in this space, but I agree with you.
Can you just say again, what is the biogenic? And it's not counted here, and it's also not counted in, I don't know, one other one that you.
Yeah, it's not counted anywhere. And
So
it is that concept that, so for example, ethanol is probably a better timescale example, where the assumption is that if you add ethanol to your fuel, that kind of carbon in that ethanol will, when the vegetation that produced that ethanol regrows the next year, that it will take out the amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that was put in, or that was emitted when you burned the fuel. And that's essentially the concept behind this. And that's why wood is a little trickier with the timescales, because it does depend on how long it takes that forest to regenerate. And so I hope that answers your question.
well, it does, but it also makes me think about like, so that ethanol is coming from corn that's grown in the middle of the country. That's sort of like, and is that accounted for? And first of all, do you agree that it's sequestering the same amount as it's creating in that cycle?
Not sure how to answer that. I think that's the assumption that pretty much everybody makes at this point. And there are analyses, life cycle analyses, et cetera, that will assign a different value to that. But in terms of kind of the framework of this in-boundary inventory that we're talking about, that's pretty much the assumption that everybody has used. And I think there are states that are thinking about different ways to do that, or accounting for the biogenic component. But as I was mentioning, I think there's a lot of moving pieces all over the place right now when it comes to thinking on that.
And then to the life cycle sort of analysis of it, like getting it here, it seems to me it's pretty significant cost.
I think you're probably right. Where I'm not a life cycle expert, and we are having a contractor, as Secretary Moore mentioned, look into that. And so we will definitely have some kind of factors to apply to those kind of totals that will give us some more information. As Secretary Moore also mentioned, it's hard to kind of actually combine the life cycle emissions with the in-boundary inventory, because it's just a totally different framework, and we don't have life cycle information for every piece of the inventory. That would be, I don't think, I haven't never heard of anybody with an in-boundary or with a kind of economy-wide inventory that's entirely life cycle.
Right.
Wouldn't surprise me if people are working on it, but I haven't heard of it yet.
Representative Sibilia.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Smythe, can you explain why the various graphs have different scale? So they're measuring at different scale. It's pretty significant, and it
is, yes.
makes it all look very similar when it's not, in fact.
You're absolutely right. And I should have put in the inventory itself, I have a little kind of a pie chart next to this graph that shows kind of the percent slice of the total. I'm sorry I didn't include that in this. It's kind of because some of these would be tiny, like the fossil fuel industry one is really, really small. I certainly could have set them on the same scale for this. I frankly I took these from the inventory itself and kind of put them in here where I had that graph. So I apologize for that, but that's a very good point that I should have made, that there are very different scales to these.
That graph might be helpful if we could have that, Madam Chair.
And the
Sure.
stacked bar that was on the fourth slide in my presentation, they are to scale with one another.
Okay,
They are,
thank you.
but yes, I can provide those pie charts as well. That'd be helpful.
And I have one more follow-up to the very first question of this round, I think was on slide 12, the electricity slide is very volatile. But I also note the scale is smaller. So
It is smaller. It is definitely a volatile sector. And I think before, and this is kind of predating my time doing this, but before the renewable energy standard, there wasn't a whole lot to kind of maybe influence the choices of utilities in terms of their purchases. And so I don't think the focus for them was probably as much, and this is me speculating a little bit, but I think the focus was probably not as much for them back then on driving greenhouse gas reductions. It was probably more about cost. But again, that's me speculating a little bit. Any other questions, or shall I keep plowing on? All right. Industrial processes is the next one. And that it consists of a number of kind of different components, but the two that are overwhelmingly dominate in Vermont are semiconductor manufacturing and what are called ozone depleting substitutes, or ODS substitutes, which are kind of the replacements for chemicals that damage the ozone layer, which unfortunately have high global warming potentials. And so they're generally very potent warming gases. And so those are the two that kind of dominate this sector. I guess the semiconductor manufacturing data from, I believe it's 2011 onward, is directly reported to EPA. And so we kind of have those are pretty solid numbers. Before 2011, that data doesn't really exist. And so I kind of had to back calculate based on actually the most recent inventory. I used to back calculate it. Now there is kind of an EPA estimate that's specific to Vermont for that sector. And so I used that curve to take that backwards to 1990. For the ozone depleting substitutes, that's a pretty involved estimate. And so we use a tool that California has developed for the US Climate Alliance states to estimate that. And California has done a lot of work in this space in terms of estimating emissions from refrigerants and things like that that they incorporate into this. And they put it on a per capita basis. So it's kind of per person, and then you can adjust some of the different factors in your state, like light duty vehicles and amount of your households with air conditioning units and things like that will adjust your total. And so that is where those come from. And as I mentioned, those are the dominating ones in this sector.
And what are the sort of the gray in 2005 and 1990? Those are our benchmark years.
Yeah, I highlighted.
Okay, and then the sort of odd square U in the middle, the lower data in what?
Yeah, I honestly don't know what drove that. That is interesting. I can look at that and let you know if you'd like.
Curious.
Yeah. Any other questions on this sector? All right. The waste and wastewater. So this is another one of the biogenic CO2 ones, where biogenic CO2 is not included in these totals. And so it's the vast majority of it is methane, especially, from both waste and wastewater. For the solid waste, like the landfill component, essentially, I use the reported landfill gas totals from kind of, especially Coventry and Moortown are the two that are the main contributors in the state. and Moortown is closed, but it's still producing gas and it still has engines, and they report to their quality and climate division how much gas passes through those engines. And so I'm able to use that to come up with a total and then an assumed fugitive percentage that is not captured within those engines. And then that is then multiplied. 15% is added to that to account for kind of all the closed landfills in the state. And that was a number from multiple years ago now, from our solid waste sector. And I think they were going to actually look at that, and we may update that in the next iteration. But that's how that number is arrived at. Wastewater is pretty much just the EPA SIF module, with a couple of small Vermont modifications, like number of households on septic. Is one that we change in there.
Can you give us an example of what the biogenic in this sector is?
Sure. This one is always a weird one for me, but it's essentially all the carbon dioxide that comes from the decomposition of the materials in the landfill. And the rationale behind that is that it's if that material had broken down, well, I guess it's if it was a biogenic origin. So especially so the carbon dioxide, the gas that would be released. It's kind of the same argument that originally it was produced from a material, vegetation or wood or whatever that would then resequester the carbon dioxide with its regrowth. But it's also assuming that if the material were to break down outside of the landfill, that it would be producing carbon dioxide instead of methane. And so it's not accounting for, I guess it's not accounting for that carbon dioxide of the biogenic origin that kind of would have been produced outside of the landfill setting, if that makes sense. And yes.
Representative Pat.
Just to clarify what I think you said about the landfill. So landfills produce methane, but in Coventry's case and other landfills, a significant part of the methane is then used to generate energy, which does create carbon dioxide, but eliminates the methane. So you are counting, that is included in the calculation.
We are not counting the carbon dioxide.
Wow.
Not counting the car. Okay.
You know of it, but you're just letting it go into the atmosphere. We're not counting it.
Yeah, and that is, again, that's based on the IPCC guidelines, and they say don't include that in your kind of gross totals. Track that as a separate piece, and I'm working on putting together estimates for that. I'm not quite finished with them yet, but
and on the flip side, I'm very familiar with the Coventry landfill plant.
Yeah.
So, on the flip side of that, what it also isn't being counted is what if there wasn't generating electricity there, what would the alternative be? In other words, what would be the emissions of some other source other than that? So
right.
That's still my life cycle thinking.
Gotcha. Yeah, it doesn't account for that kind of substitution factor like you're talking about. You're right.
So I just want to follow up that, like, you're going to estimate the biogenic CO2 in just this sector or in others?
So I have estimates for transportation. I'm working on a couple of them. I believe I have it done for transportation, and I have it done for the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use. I'm still working on it in the solid waste sector. I might have to get back to you on the other ones. Yeah, but the two biggest one, the biggest one for sure is the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use one. That's the highest biogenic total. And that's kind of why that's been the focus to calculate that one.
Thank you. All set.
Question, all set? Okay.
Yeah, these last three graphs, the last two, this one and the last one and the one coming up, are such a very tiny. You look at the scale and think, wow, it's a lot. You look at the left-hand column, and these are very, very tiny.
You are absolutely correct. And yeah, I apologize again for not including those pie charts. They're definitely helpful to see that or to point that out in a clear way. But yes, it's a very small component. And as Secretary Moore mentioned, pretty much all the rest of the fossil fuels are captured in kind of all the other sectors of the inventory. And so this is exclusively the leakage of natural gas from service lines and transmission lines and distribution lines in Vermont. And so it's just a number of services and kind of by service material type and miles of pipeline by type with an emission factor applied to them. That's from EPA, I believe, to come up with that total. Any questions on that one? Or? All right. And I think our last one, I can go into this a little bit. We've kind of talked a lot about this slide already in terms of the biogenic and the land use component. But I guess I will just flag again that we are in this soon to be released iteration of the inventory using land use change and forestry values that are taken. EPA took them from kind of the national inventory report and kind of scaled them down to all the different states. And so we're using those because it is at least capturing all kind of the different components of that sector that should be in here. The state inventory tool, the SIT tool previously did not really capture all those. And we had even less kind of confidence in that data before. As I mentioned, there's still a lot of uncertainty around those estimates, but we at least wanted to put them in there as a framework so that when the data does get better, we can update them as we need to. And I guess I'll just emphasize again that previously this sector was almost exclusively focused on kind of forests and forest carbon and changes in that. And we still include that, but now we include kind of these other components as well. Let's see if there's anything else. I think I've covered all the rest of that probably already. I'm happy to talk through it again if you'd like, but
to remind us what I'm sorry if I missed this.
No, it's fine.
What are the pieces that go into this? Because it's not ag, it's not forestry, it's
not ag. There is definitely forestry in here. So it includes kind of both. There's a lot of detail in this sector, and I don't remember the total number, but it's on the order of 12 different components, I think, where it's kind of conversions between all the different land types. And so it will be like cropland to forest and forest to cropland and forest to settlement and forest to grazing land or something like that. And they have kind of different carbon flux factors that they estimate for every one of those.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. That helps.
Okay, great.
All right. Are you're finished with your?
I believe that is the last one. Yes.
Okay, thank you. All right, members, final questions? Thank you for joining us, Secretary Moore and Mr. Smythe.
Thank you very much for having me.
Members, we're going to take a 5-minute break. Come back at